Welcome to Her Story, the history of Southeast Asia told from her perspective. We'll discover historical figures, matriarchal societies, and contemporary female icons, and maybe learn about ourselves along the way. I'm your host, Agus Ramirez. We're continuing our deep dive into the Manila Carnival, a 2-week festival held during the early American colonial period, which culminated in the crowning of the Queen and her court at an elaborate formal ball. For 31 years, young women from across the country vied for the title, navigating racial prejudice and standards of beauty, and becoming an integral part of the nation-building process. Last time, we talked about the origins of the Manila Carnival and how we found our first queen, in so many senses of the word, in Pura Garcia Villanueva Kalaw. Listen to that episode first if you haven't. Now, in part 2, we'll follow the carnival as it comes into its own. This is part 2, Becoming Miss Philippines, 1909 to 1926. When the first Manila Carnival ended, Governor General James Francis Smith told the Chief of the Bureau of Insular Affairs of the Department of War that the event was a magnificent success and there was unanimous demand for its repetition in 1909. With a proof of concept in hand, the second Manila Carnival went all out, focusing on grand displays of secular entertainment. The vibe was said to be New Orleans Mardi Gras. They came up with a fresh logo which you can find on Alex D. R. Castro's blog. Quote, "The logo shows 3 carnival symbols of revelry, a court jester and 2 masked female revelers, one in a Gibson girl hat, the other in a native barro, to symbolize the unity of East and West. Below the smiling jester is the Great Seal of Manila. A ribbon carried the text, The Philippine Carnival, festooned on top with coconut and anahaw leaves. The date of the event is on a crest between the 2 female figures, February 1909, Manila." Unquote. If you want to know what a Gibson girl is, go back to episode 16, Filipino Girlhood in American Colonial Manila with Talawong. The Carnival Committee still chose to award both an American and a Filipino Carnival Queen, but since they couldn't handle the voting last time, they figured a lottery was better. On the day of the carnival, a group of 10 Filipinas and 12 American women were part of the draw. They walked into the hippodrome dressed in the finest gowns of the time. Among the Filipinas, a name was drawn, Julia Guerrero Agkawili of Ilocos Norte. Julia was born to Julio Agkawili, the first ever governor of Ilocos Norte, and Ruperta Guerrero, a Spanish mestiza. She was the 4th of 12 children and was very musically inclined. Her education was mostly traditional. She was taught music by nuns. She sang and played the harp and the piano. She was 20 when she took part in the carnival, and because of her talent, good manners, prominent cheekbones, and powerful background, she attracted many admirers. Governor Julio Agkawili was not a fan of this, so he appointed her brother, Francisco, as her escort and bodyguard. At her coronation, again from Alex D. R. Castro, she wore an empire-cut dress of sheer net over taffeta with gold and silver thread embellished with rhinestones and sequins. She wore a small crown and held an ivory scepter as emblems of her royal authority. Her royal court included a dozen princes and princesses from well-known families. A little bit more about Julia because I'm sure you're curious too. The following year, she married Jose Martinez, a Spanish mestizo from Lawag, and they would settle in Cebu with their 10 children. Her sister Pilar would later also become a Manila Carnival Queen, while her 8th daughter, Teresita, would become Miss Cebu after the war. Julia passed away in 1945 of a bone disease she had since childhood. Her mementos are in the Pidig Museum in Ilocos Norte, her hometown. That's definitely going on my list of places to visit. As in the previous episode, we are drawing on the work of Genevieve Clotario in Beauty Regimes, A History of Power and Modern Empire in the Philippines, 1898 to 1941. This is from Chapter 2, Queenmakers, and I highly suggest you get this book. It's available on Amazon. It's a perfect companion to Stephanie Ku's Clothing the Colony, where she talks about 19th century Philippine fashion. This is such a rabbit hole, but I might do a bonus episode on Clothing the Colony as well. Back to the carnival. The 1909 edition of the Manila Carnival was not successful, financially speaking. The organizers overspent and failed to earn revenues. In fact, they were facing a 55,000 peso debt. Governor General Forbes, you know the guy they named Forbes Park after, was forced to take out loans from various banks. So the next year he said, okay, we can still do the carnival, but you have to reuse the hippodrome, and you can't spend on anything we don't really need. It's unclear whose decision it was, but they didn't hold the pageant even though it would have probably made them money. Clotario speculates that this was because they weren't interested in the feminized pageant and wanted to focus on colonial businesses and industries. And so in 1910 and 1911, there were Manila Carnivals, just no queens. Not to worry though, the queens would make a triumphant return in 1912. The 1912 carnival featured bigger floats, more elaborate industrial exhibitions, and a program that reinstated the Manila Carnival Queen Contest. There were 3 separate titles for Filipino, American, and Spanish winners, who each had their own dedicated days throughout the event. The second day of the carnival, February 4, 1912, was Filipino Day and Night. Side note, February 4, 1899 was actually the start of the Filipino-American War. Because it was a secular event, it started with an educational conference. Speakers were the president of the University of the Philippines, the superintendent of the School of the Arts, and the director of the Girls' Central School, Libra Veorino. At this point, Filipinos were becoming increasingly enthusiastic about the carnival and how it allowed them to perform a national identity with flags, music, and speeches by prominent officials. They even had a live diorama of the Philippines, with Manila at the center of it. Filipino Day and Night was much bigger than the American and Spanish celebrations. Of course, the main event was still the coronation. This time, they showcased one queen for each geopolitical region. Paz de Guzman was Queen of Luzon, Amparo Noel was Queen of the Visayas, and Rosario Reyes was the Sultana of Mindanao. That evening, the 3 majesties crowned the grand prize winner, the Empress Paz Marquez y Jurado. She was born in 1894 in Lucena, Tayabas, and you probably know her by her married name, Paz Marquez Benitez. She was a celebrated Filipino writer and educator who was known for her athletic prowess. She captained Manila's first girls' basketball team and played tennis in European dress. In 1925, she published Dead Stars in the Philippine Herald, widely acknowledged to be the first modern English short story written by a Filipino, giving rise to a new generation of writers and writing that we still enjoy today. If you want to know more about Paz Marquez Benitez and Dead Stars, go over to the Patreon. You'll be able to listen to that bonus episode along with 7 others, and you'll also be helping out the show. In 1913, the Manila Carnival Queen Contest became an exclusively Filipina competition. Then, over the next several years, the contest kept changing its contestant selection criteria. Remember, they were having trouble between balloting and lottery. Eventually, it transitioned from a popularity contest to a beauty pageant. The woman who represented the most ideal woman was crowned queen. One big part of this is, obviously, beauty, which was then defined as Hispanic mestiza or Chinese mestiza. I say then defined, but you still see this in local show business today and even just in regular life. I'm morena and the number of times glutathione drips have been suggested to me is insane. Genevieve Clotario writes, photographs of Filipino beauty contestants and their female entourages show their European-like features such as light skin, small straight noses, large eyes, and tall, slender frames. Textual descriptions also highlight mestiza features by including visual details like a contestant's lovely delicate face or a queen's fair cheek, unquote. But beauty pageants aren't just about beauty. It's about the ideal woman. As historian Mina Rosas writes, quote, the Tagalog word maganda does not simply mean beautiful. It is also connected with what society considers good or virtuous. To be considered beautiful also means to exude the virtues of her gender, unquote. There were exceptions, though. Here's a quick side story about the queen of the Benguet Carnival. Evelyn Chinos Guire was a 30-year-old Benguet native who was crowned queen of the Benguet Carnival in 1915. She became the fair's major attraction and drew crowds of up to 8,000 people. She was petite, had long straight hair, a morena complexion, and a regal bearing. She either wore her native garments of green and purple silk or western gowns with a long gauze train. She also wore a unique tiara made of copper and silver plates with a precious ruby stone set at the center. All of this is to say, China's looked different. So when she arrived in Manila to participate in the Manila Carnival contest, people were kind of obsessed. She represented Benguet with her traditional garments and accessories, and again, this all happened when she was just 13. I'm reminded of how in episode 20, Herb Bunag's photographs of early 20th century Siam, we talked about the role that traditional clothing played when showcased at the center of power. In that case, it was Dararasami, a Lao native, who wore the textile pattern and garment styles of her hometown for cultural and political reasons when she arrived in Bangkok or Krungtep to become a consort of King Chulalongkorn. Okay, so back to China's. As the story of China's would have already clued you in on, the pageant was truly nationwide, which in a new nation was pretty big. While the coronation was always held in Manila, a network and an industry developed around it that actually connected the different regions through the contestants, their prominent families, colonial officials, investors, dressmakers, and workers in related industries. Alex D. R. Castro writes that later, China's attended the Philippine Normal School after she was chosen by the school director, Mrs. Alice Kelly. Here's where it gets sad. She was taking a nursing course at St. Luke's Hospital, but she contracted tuberculosis from which she never recovered. She was only 18 when she died. Episcopal Bishop Florencio Mosher was by her side at the time. Schools were closed, classes were suspended, and a large crowd that included mayors and governors attended her funeral on October 5, 1920. 10 years later, a motion picture theater along Session Road was named Alhamar China's in her memory. The theater itself doesn't exist anymore, but if you've ever been to Baguio City, it once stood at what is now the Sky Road Commercial Center, right by the Baguio Public Market. There are so many more stories of each queen, it's impossible to talk about all of them here. Okay, for example, in 1917, Mela Kamaki Fairchild won. She was the daughter of the founder of the Manila Times and the first and only American woman to solely win the title. In 1924, Trinidad Rodriguez Fernandez won the title. Later, she became the English language editor of a pro-suffrage publication, The Woman's Outlook, and the president of the Manila Symphony Society. After the war, she led the reorganization of the National Federation of Women's Clubs, and in 1958, she was appointed Chief of Mission to Saigon and Minister Plenipotentiary to Laos and Cambodia. So, the former Carnival Queen became the first Filipino woman ambassador. If you're interested to read more, and there really is so much more, just hop on over to Alex D. R. Castro's blog, manilacarnivals.blogspot.com. In 1926, the Philippines was invited to participate in the international pageant of pulchritude in Galveston, Texas. The title Miss Universe actually originated from this pageant. Because it was international, the title Miss Philippines was created. At the 1926 coronation, there was actually a tie for Miss Philippines between Anita Agoncillo Noble of Lemery, Batangas, and Carmen Fargas of Zamboanga. This is a crazy story because after 2 attempts to break the tie, they still couldn't declare a winner and it was already past midnight, so they had to postpone the coronation. Then they called in Senate President Manuel L. Quezon to decide the winner. Senate President. Allegedly, he invited the contestants the next day to the Manila Hotel. He asked them to be dressed in simple barot saya and wear no makeup. And he also added another judge to break the deadlock. So the judging continued the next day, and the girls were judged on how they ate lunch. Finally, the first ever Miss Philippines was declared, Anita Agoncillo Noble. If the surname is familiar, it's because she was related to several famous Agoncillos, namely Marcela, maker of the first Philippine flag, Maria, wife of Emilio Aguinaldo, and Felipe, diplomat of the First Philippine Republic. Carmen Fargas didn't go home empty-handed, though. She was declared Miss Pearl of the Orient Seas. Other big winners that year were Miss Luzon, Rosario Genato of Manila, Miss Visayas, Aurora Reyes of Samar, and Miss Mindanao, Bala Amay Miring of Lanao. I think Carmen Fargas and Aurora Reyes were good friends if you look at their photo together. 1926 was also the final year we had a Miss Manila Carnival. She was Socorro Henson of Angeles, Pampanga. At the time, she was 19 and a student of home economics at the College of the Holy Ghost. She went with a Hindu-Arabic theme. She wore a beaded sari gown and a crown topped with a feathered headdress, and she rode on the back of a real elephant during her auditorium parade. And that's it. Socorro Henson was the last one. From 1927 onwards, Miss Philippines replaced Miss Manila Carnival. And remember, the president of the Commonwealth of the Philippines wasn't elected until 1935. So, Miss Philippines predates the actual president of the Philippines. As Clutario writes, by the 1927 Miss Philippines contest, the visual symbols had changed. Promotional materials began to showcase only Miss Philippines and the Philippine flag. While Miss Philippines had no official political role, she was the figurehead of the Philippine nation. Next time, in the third installment of Meet Me at the Manila Carnival, we'll talk about the end of an era, 1927 to 1939, the final years of the pageant before the outbreak of the Second World War. If you want to join the Patreon, you can give as little as $1 to get a copy of the show notes with all the references, a shout out at the end of the next episode, and access to bonus episodes. We have an interview with Haldi Patra on the Minangkabau Matriarchal Society, Maying Taphan and the Krom Klone, Nyage de Pinate, the Harbor Master of Gresik, Queen Soriotha and the War Elephants, Paz Marquez Benitez and Dead Stars, the rise and fall of the Achinese Queens, 1641 to 1699, the portrait of Dara Rasami, and the women of number 14 Lebulis. Thank you to our patrons, Akila, Karen, Kero, Shami by Milish, Jennifer, Christina, Raul, Raymond, Matt, Shireen, Charlie, and Yati. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Her Story CPod. That's Her Story, SEA Pod. There's so many more stories to tell, and we're just getting started. This podcast was hosted and edited by Agnes Ramirez. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next time. Maraming salamat.